Welcome to our History channel. History too real for the Westerns. Don't forget to click, like, share, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and leave us a comment if you like this story. August 12th, 1840, near present-day Lockhart, Texas. In the humid, burning dawn, so common to central Texas summers, 24-year-old Nancy Darce Crosby sat dejectedly on the back of an unshod, rough-haired pony, though her skin was terribly sunburnt, and her thighs horribly chafed from days of riding. She said nothing, for it would do no good. All she could do was run the events of the previous few days through her head. She and a number of other captives, mostly women, had been taken during a series of brutal Comanche raids along the South Texas coast. They had watched their loved ones cut down, their homes burned to the ground, and entire populations of their hometowns scattered into the shallow Texas bays to seek refuge from the attack in wooden merchant ships anchored offshore. They had come all the way to Texas relatively recently, most of them from frontier states like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Nancy herself was the granddaughter of legendary frontiersman Daniel Boone. She had settled in South Texas, married, and given birth to a son only a little over a year earlier. A blissful family life seemed all but assured until the Comanche came on that one dreadful day. They had killed her husband and taken her and her baby son captive. The customary Comanche treatment of women's prisoners would be termed inhumane by any measure, with sexual assault being an assumed norm, and the outright killing of captives being a matter wholly left to the whims of their captors. Nancy's whalebone corset had prevented the sexual assault, but her baby had been summarily stabbed to death in front of her, when she could not quiet the child's screams. One can only imagine what she felt only days later, as she faced yet another day of ceaseless torment. This party of Comanche, though typical in their tactics, was highly unusual, both in the size and scope of the raiding they had committed. They also presented a strikingly unusual visual. Many wore the traditional breechcloths and leggings, with headdresses made of buffalo horns, feathers, wolf's heads, and one even wearing the skin of a sand crane atop his head. They were armed with bows, arrows, 14-foot lances, shields, and a number of pistols and rifles they had procured in trading and raiding. But perhaps the most striking sight in the roving riding band was the adornment of its warriors in some of the newest, trendiest fashions of the time. Top hats, new leather boots, blankets, lace, umbrellas, and brass button coats worn backwards. To top off this bizarre scene, war horses, lances, and shields were all festooned with links of bright red ribbons. The sheer size of this force was also a highly unusual factor that day. Comanche raiding parties usually struck swiftly and scattered immediately after a raid. But this party included the wives and children of the warriors, for this was no ordinary raid. It had started when the Comanche chief, Buffalo Hump, had awakened one night, having seen a vision in his dream. Only weeks earlier, the Comanche had suffered the loss of many of their greatest war chiefs in what came to be known as the Council House fight. The Comanche had brought in a young captive white girl named Matilda Lockhart in order to trade her surrender for goods and an agreement to the cessation of any more white trespass. But the horrendously pitiable condition of the young girl caused such an uproar in the town of San Antonio that an arrest was attempted. When that was resisted, the chiefs were shot down. It had been a seminal event in recent Comanche history, and Buffalo Hump and his band of Panatica Comanche had burned for revenge ever since. But it wasn't until Buffalo Hump reported his vision to his people that a plan for revenge began to materialize. In his dream, he had seen the Panatica and their allies, the Kiowas, driving the white intruders into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Those that they were not able to kill outright were expelled from Texas forever. The victory would be glorious, the spoils innumerable, and the redemption for the Comanche total. And up until this point, Buffalo Hump had proven all but prophetic. The Comanche raiding party had cut a torrent of violence south from the Texas Hill Country to the coast, and now they were on their return trip. But now, three factors were working against them as they made their way back northwest, back to the limestone and cedar of the hill country. First, the bounty they had fought so brutally to ascertain now became a burden. The weight of the iron cookware, cloth, clothing, firearms, ammunition, food, and other sundries, not to mention their terribly traumatized and physically compromised captives, slowed the party's advancement considerably. Secondly, the Comanche had not only broken their typical practice of scattering after a raid, but were following the same trail to get back home that they had used to make their attacks in the first place. This made them easy for trackers to follow, which was not often the case after native raids. This led us to our third and final problem faced by Buffalo Hump and his sizable contingent. They were now being tracked by the Texas Rangers, as well as a number of local militiamen. This made a rapid egress all the more important, yet simultaneously difficult to accomplish. The Rangers, a relatively recently formed force, had thus far presented some of the only consequential resistance to the Comanches in the whole of Texas. They were largely young, violence-hungry men who had come to Texas for the express purpose of tracking, trailing, and killing Comanches. According to several contemporary accounts, at this time, their mortality rate was around 50%. These young men were becoming a sizable thorn in the side of the Comanche, but were simultaneously experiencing a sort of Darwinism via combat, in which the weaker and/or more unfortunate among them became weeded out via hard, often torturous deaths at the hands of the Comanche. Nonetheless, these bellicose young men armed with revolvers and Bowie knives and clad in serapes and buckskin represented the only hope that Nancy Doris Crosby and her fellow captives had left. If they were not rescued before reaching the undulating topography of the hill country, they would be taken on to the prairie, and very likely never seen again. Neither the captives nor the captors were aware of just how close the Rangers and their cohorts were. Though, while the raiding party made its languid march northwestward, the Rangers were making every move within their power to garner additional forces, as well as track the Comanche. The Ranger ranks included men whose names would become legendary in the annals of Texas history. Bigfoot Wallace, Ben and Henry McCulloch, Matthew Old Paint Caldwell, Ed Burleson, John Tomlinson, and Jack Hay. Several of the Rangers had been tracking the Comanche with the help of their Tonkawa scouts under their chief, Placido. The Tonkawa are a tribe native to central Texas who had been devastated for generations by Comanche raiding and expansion. All too often unheralded in conventional narratives of the West, native scouts were essentially the only trackers skilled enough to actually find villages that forces like the Rangers and the U.S. Army sought to engage. Their willingness to assist in hunting down and often killing their fellow native peoples speaks to just how deep the divisions could run between tribes. At the same time, local militia forces from around the area were being marshaled under the leadership of the relatively inexperienced Felix Houston. They received word that they were to rendezvous with the Rangers at a designated spot on a small tributary of the San Marcos River, about 40 miles north-northeast of San Antonio. Houston and his volunteers arrived at this spot on what is today known as Plum Creek, dismounted, and waited for the Comanche. They had placed themselves directly in line with the Comanche's path, and it would be only a short time until the lumbering Comanche party came into view. But for all their bloodlust and anger, the relative neophytes to combat on the Texas frontier hesitated. The Comanche party, although composed in large part of women, children, and elderly members, was still far larger than the Texan. Though they had the advantage in position and firepower, plus the element of surprise, Houston was unwilling to make an outright attack on the party until the more experienced Rangers arrived. The Rangers, for their part, were all making their way as fast as possible to the scene. But as some were coming from a variety of locations, due to having been out on patrol, the arrival of their full force had been momentarily delayed. Houston was, undoubtedly, in a difficult position. Should he make a cavalier charge when he was ill-equipped to lead, he might lose many of his own men. Thus Houston and his volunteers took up a defensive position, hunkering down and preparing to receive the Comanche charge that would inevitably come when they were spotted. Houston's men dismounted, a nearly always mortal mistake in warfare against mounted tribes, and began to pepper the large Comanche party with shots, as well as make half-hearted advances, only to be driven back by Comanche attacks. The Comanche warriors, perhaps the world's best horsemen at the time, began to ride back and forth in front of their people, red streamers whipping in the wind, and new top hats flying off their heads. They rode suicidally close to the Texan lines, with some indeed losing their lives to Texan bullets. For the Comanche, though, as has been noted by several military tacticians, these are not offensive attacks meant to unseat the Texans from their ground, nor even necessarily kill them all. The Comanche intention, with their great visual display and seemingly complete disregard for their own personal well-being, was to create a distraction that would be so all-encompassing for their enemy that the retreat of their wives and children would go unnoticed. For roughly half an hour, these exchanges continued. As the Rangers began to arrive and assess the situation, though they became more and more impatient with Houston's refusal to take offensive action. Just then, a Comanche chief with a resplendent white shield and feather headdress led a charge to within yards of the Texas position. But the Texan bullets managed to cut him down on his retreat back to his line, and at this point everything changed. The Comanche, who often believed a warrior's medicine or puha would make him invulnerable to bullets, were so shaken by this that an all-out retreat began. And at this point, the Rangers' patience with Houston had been exhausted. Ben McCulloch, a legendary Ranger captain, exhorted the volunteer commander that, "Now's the time, Captain. Charge them. They are whipped." Every second they hesitated meant more distance between themselves and the Comanche, and more importantly, the Comanche's captives. The Texans mounted, and the Rangers led the way, as a running fight would ensue over roughly 15 miles of rolling prairie and cactus-strewn hills. The Comanche continued westward toward the hillier country around the Colorado River west of Austin. For hours arrows flew, screams and gunshots resounded, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the iron-tinged aroma of blood. Bodies of men, women, and children littered the ground. The wounded were shot dead without exception. One Comanche woman's head was stomped into an unrecognizable mass of bone and tissue. Eventually, the volunteers, Rangers, and Takawa scouts would regroup to assess their losses and to discuss the next course of action. They had inflicted at least 80 dead upon the Comanche and sent them fleeing for their lives into the hill country. By mathematical standards, the Battle of Plum Creek, as it would come to be known, was a resounding victory for the Texans. However, they had only recovered a fraction of the 3,000 head of horses that had been stolen, as well as a fraction of the goods that had been apprehended. And though they had certainly hastened the retreat of their adversaries, the Texans as a whole had failed in achieving their primary objective, the recapturing of the hostages that had been taken by the Comanche. And when the scouting parties were sent out, it came upon the horrific consequences of their failure. Nancy Crosby was found not long before sundown. She had been tied to a tree, presumably crying out and fighting. As the battle whirled nearby, the gunshots and battle cries likely drowned out her desperate pleas to be spared. But she was not spared. Nancy Crosby was mercilessly drilled with several Comanche arrows through her torso. Her death had likely been quick, but certainly not painless. In the last week of Nancy Crosby's life, she had been kidnapped, assaulted, watched her husband, and then her baby killed in front of her, and been subjected to endless torment and torture at the hands of her captors. Her only fleeting hope had seemed all too close, and then her life was ruthlessly snuffed out when her rescue was presumably only minutes away. One could be forgiven for thinking that such horrors were the exception, but Nancy Crosby's story was all too common on the bleeding frontier of Texas. This was not the land of dying novels or tall tales. This was an unforgiving place that was seemingly inextricably ensconced in a cycle of violence, grief, and revenge. But, as S.C. Gwynne points out in Empire of the Summer Moon, the deaths of Nancy Crosby and her fellow captives were not the result of random violence. Their lives were seen as currency, as just retribution for the many Panateca Comanche who had been cut down in the streets and courthouse of San Antonio. Those Comanche were killed in retribution for the treatment of the young Matilda Lockhart. Matilda Lockhart had been kidnapped and treated as a subhuman because she was of a people who were trespassing on, killing, and attempting to end the way of life of the Comanche, just as the Comanche had done to the Apache before them. And so the story of the Old West goes, an endless succession of transgression and retribution. Many of the Rangers there that day would go on to legendary careers and fight in some of the most significant battles in the history of Texas. Houston would be forever hampered in his political ambitions by the prevailing, and not wholly inaccurate, perception that he had cost at least some of the captives their lives due to his unwillingness to pursue more offensive tactics. The Battle of Plum Creek would be only the beginning in the Texas conflict with the Comanche. However, it would mark the last time the Comanche would attempt raiding of such a massive scale and scope. The bloodshed in Texas would not only carry on for decades to come, it would only intensify. The tales of raiding, rescue, and revenge in the Old West are innumerable, and rest assured we here at Hawk will do our best to cover all of them. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. But what do you think? What was the flashpoint that started all of this? Could this have been avoided altogether? Could Huston making a charge earlier have saved lives? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral. History too real for the West.